Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jim. Oh boy. Let me start by acknowledging what a big night this is. The end of the first black presidency in the United States, the eve of a very dramatic transition in power to Donald Trump, and the palpable sense of fear and expectation and hope and anger in this room. I am really humbled that I get to share this moment with you. It sort of already makes us more than strangers. And I have a lot I'd like to throw at you this evening. The fact that I get to speak with you about inequality makes it all the more special and all the more daunting. Inequality is always difficult. It's difficult because it contains so many of the divisions among us, and it can be thought about in so many different and often conflicting ways. And whichever words you use to discuss inequality, I find you have to be very careful. You can't just gloss over one side or another because the words tell about lives. People's experiences live in those words. Inequality, I think we've come now to recognize, is also important because just about all the economic research on the subject from all over the world strongly indicates that the more inequality you have, the less growth you have, and the less competitiveness, and the less happiness, yes, they measure happiness, and shorter lives. So inequality is up there with climate change as something we should all be trying to reduce, but it's no less difficult to wrap our collective hands around its meanings. This presidential election was about a lot of things. For me, it was ultimately about two things: inequality and accountability. I'll explain a bit about that later, but I really want to start by suggesting some ways to think about inequality that I hope you'll find helpful. And so my talk this evening is in four parts. Now, as Jim made clear, I am both a student and a teacher of inequality, which makes me incredibly popular at parties. People just love to hear my insights and observations. I'm followed around like the guy with the hors d'oeuvres. No, I do okay, depending on the party. But anyway, I'm a law professor and a civil rights lawyer. I teach my students to think about inequality because thinking about inequality leads you to think about unfairness. And thinking about unfairness prepares you to work on fairness. However, it's really not as simple as it often seems. And in my experience at home, I've discovered how 6-year-olds screw this up all the time. If one 6-year-old grows taller than the other, it's not fair. If one gets 4 cookies and the other one gets 2, it's unfair. They think every inequality is an unfairness, but that's not really so, right? I mean, a disparity is only a difference, and the disparity is an outcome that we can measure. We need to know what produced the inequality. An inequality is unfair if it has been achieved through a wrong, an injustice, like discriminatory acts or discriminatory policies, cheating, and especially inequity. So the kid who doesn't grow because she is undernourished in a country of great wealth, that's a problem of fairness. The kid who doesn't eat because she has a disorder is another kind of problem, but it's not necessarily unfairness. In the constitutional sense, the inequality that we usually object to is inequitably achieved inequality. Inequality that came about because of an unfair process, bad rules, racial discrimination, poor administration, implicit biases, or corruption. So that's what we look for from a rights standpoint. That's what the Constitution is generally designed to protect against. We try to fix all this in the name of opportunity. So let's call this kind of inequality rights-based inequality, because it is based on rights people think they have as a result of the Constitution and other laws. It is often identified with safeguarding the interests of minority groups, just as the framers intended. For instance, when we see wildly disproportionate foreclosure rates among Black and Latino homeowners, Amid a foreclosure crisis affecting tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans, we're witnessing inequality of wealth loss. It is not a sign of how financially irresponsible black and brown homeowners are. Other people default on their mortgages too, but other people were not targeted by subprime lending terms based on their segregated zip codes. And other people often found processes of loan modification or refinancing at much higher rates than black and brown homeowners, especially in the state of New Jersey. It's the processes then that led to segregation and the discriminatory exploitation of that segregation that makes those foreclosures an example of rights-based inequality. Otherwise, it might just be a problem of markets or insufficient regulation. Of course, there is another kind of inequality, the kind championed by both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders this election year. The intersection of these two inequalities is the crux of my point this evening. The other kind of inequality goes back to the kid who got only 2 cookies when others got 4. So let's assume for a moment that she wasn't discriminated against, that there was no corrupt cookie dispenser who favored the other kids over her and the other kids weren't slipped a couple of cookies under the table. They simply ran out of cookies when they got to her, and she is understandably crushed. Her expectations are dashed. And even if there were no other kids getting cookies, she would feel angry about receiving only 2 cookies when she was used to receiving 4. And this is the other kind of inequality, the kind where we receive less than we expect, less than we think we need, less than we used to get, and less than we see others getting. And I don't mean to belittle this kind of inequality by analogizing it to kids and cookies. This is what many Americans experience as inequality. Their opportunities feel less than their parents'. Their children's opportunities feel at risk. The stability they expect has been slipping for a long time. They're anxious, frustrated, they feel the situation slipping away from them. And it's a very hard place to be. And this is also a challenging inequality to label because it involves so many intangible things. But let's call it expectations inequality. It's a hard inequality to change too because it reflects policies and attitudes and assumptions that are hard to nail down and tougher to influence. It's also hard to change because the forces that created expectations inequality are sometimes structurally unfair, like deregulation of Wall Street, but they're also sometimes structurally neutral, like automation and globalization. And I say all of this because as Americans, we have a baseline understanding that each of us is free, that we are equal to each other and that we are entitled to use this freedom for equal access to the kinds of opportunities necessary for a good life. And I'll go you one better. We believe that this good life we should get comes out of a bargain, a social compact in which we sacrifice a little bit for each other because the common good, if it's strong and backed by a capable government and the smartest industries in the world, will produce the goods and services that we want. In 2008, this expectation had been soundly defeated by terrorism, a fraudulent war, and a crushing recession. Against every prediction, we elected a black man who promised hope and change. In 2016, against every prediction, we elected his successor with similar expectations in mind. And we've spent the better part of the last year trying to figure out just what Trump saw in the electorate that defied all the polls. I'm sorry, which way am I going? Oh, I'm sorry, I have it upside down. Please forgive me. There we go. Had to do it at least once, right? I would suggest that Trump has inspired millions of mostly white voters by validating their sense of inequality. That second kind of inequality, expectations inequality. The problem for us at this moment, at this point of transition, however, is that Trump, unlike Bernie, did so with a callous disregard for that other inequality, rights-based inequality. The two inequalities are deeply connected, yet he presented them as a zero-sum battle of inequalities. an us versus them type of inequality in which the blame for one is placed on the other. Many Trump voters believed the cause of their inequality was the fault of Mexican immigrants, the Chinese government, affirmative action, Muslims, lawless minorities, all conspiring in a rigged system. And most of this really doesn't stand up to fact. But more importantly, this was a missed opportunity, it seems to me. Voters on both sides had something vital to teach each other about opportunity in America in 2017. And now they don't know how. By denigrating rights-based inequality and racially weaponizing expectations inequality, Trump installed a view of inequality in which only one side can win. And this, I argue, could make us all losers. So let's look a little more closely at expectations inequality and how Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. So the simplest explanation is the most credible to me, that there was much more anger and anxiety over inequality of opportunity than any of us really thought. And that this anger was directed at governing elites who had not until November 8th been held accountable. Inequality and accountability. In terms a lot of these folks really understood, Donald Trump promised hope and change. Specifically, he promised to make America great again. I will not gloss over these words because the words tell about lives. The lives they were describing this time had not been called out by name during the discussions of, say, income inequality we've had these past 4 or 5 years. They are white lives. They are struggling against economic restructuring and globalism, which has transformed their working class and blue-collar communities, but also their expectations. Plant closures, the loss of health benefits, and a sense of economic powerlessness in a national economy that appears to have no more use for them. Pundits reprimanded us for forgetting them. The voters themselves felt betrayed. Jobs sent to Mexico, China, or automated out of human existence. Their children could not afford college or leave home for affordable places to live, and their own savings are running out. Worst, they're depressed. They're dying of suicide. They're dying of preventable disease. And just as suddenly, we were awakened to the public health crisis so many whites are experiencing through addiction. Addiction. Heroin, opioids, meth. Leaving babies to starve while parents OD'd. This was never supposed to happen. This should never happen, not to anybody. Now, if you're like me, you've been wondering exactly which historical period of American greatness Trump's slogan refers to. My sense is that it's a mythical reference primarily to the 1950s. The references to economic stability, to American global superiority, and family values puts it there, or at least it starts it there. The 1950s was a period in which a new mythology of family primacy and integrity took hold for the first time. It was an experimental time, according to Stephanie Kuntz in her famous 1996 essay called What We Really Miss About the 50s. I highly recommend it. And she writes that after the widespread domestic strife, family disruptions, and violence of the 1930s, and the instability of the World War II period, people were ready to try something new. The post-war economic boom gave them the chance. The 1950s was the first time a majority of Americans could even dream of creating a secure oasis in their immediate nuclear families. And a generous government deeply subsidized home ownership in the suburbs and access to college that built a social system of family-centered wealth creation in partnership with industrial businesses that paid high school graduates a middle-class wage and remained loyal to their communities. Marriage and birth rates increased, more women stayed at home, gender roles were clearer, divorces were less common. Again, Kuntz writes, the result was that family life and gender roles became much more predictable, orderly, settled in the 1950s than they were either 20 years earlier or would be 20 years later. It is a little amazing that this mythology is so resilient so many years later. The resonance of our grandparents, or some of our grandparents, real and confabulated experiences from the distance, from this distance, is amazing until you realize how often it has been resurrected. All the backlashes of the late 20th century have had as their themes the mythology of the greatest generation. We saw it in the late 60s with Nixon and the Southern Strategy, in the 1980s with Reagan and the moral majority, and in the culture clashes of the Republican Revolution led by Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. They all represent a backlash against a foreboding future. Yet, they all also organize around the theme of white supremacy, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly. And now, during and after the tenure of the first black president, the mythology is back as a kind of white nationalist resentment at everything he didn't do for them, but somehow did for his own. So the idea of inequality that characterized Trump's victory seems rooted in an America that began in the 1950s. Those expectations remain a fixture of conservative political movements, as well as many Americans' basic assumptions about the good life. I believe these expectations are reflected today in several core assumptions that I write about in my book, The Price of Paradise. They are pillars of the American dream that really have their origin in the immediate post-war period when that dream was born. We'll call them continuing assumptions of the American dream, and I'd like you to see if they sound familiar. Now, I'm not going to run through them in much detail. I'd rather that you all just sort of read them and see if they resonate for you. I've included 5. There's a 6th, but in the interest of time, we've sort of collapsed things a little bit. But see if they seem familiar, even if they don't feel completely true. The first is that self-sufficiency is what defines middle-class status. The second is that segregation is a thing of the past. The third, that racism no longer limits minority chances. The fourth, that poverty reflects weak values and bad decisions. And fifth, and very ironically, given the direct appeal to white resentment in this particular election, that ours is a colorblind nation and racial labels no longer matter. Now, it's important to remember that these assumptions of the American dream were created at a time when they only applied to white people. They have been adopted by other groups ever since, to the point where most of us nurture some version of these assumptions today. But I don't believe they hold any longer. These assumptions can no longer hold because too much has changed. And the hope, my hope anyway, had been that when we all came face to face with our economic anxieties, we would instead find common ground. As more of us experienced inequality of opportunity from whatever source, the words would have greater meaning to each of us. We would come to see how inequality described our lives too. People experiencing expectations inequality because of economic restructuring would better understand people who experienced both expectations inequality and rights-based inequality. With mutual recognition and a greater understanding of how inequality was weakening all of us together, we would discover each other in a social compact again. We would see how what was happening to some of us was actually happening to too many of us, and we would join each other. We would see that we need each other's success. But of course, that's not what happened, or at least not yet. So it turns out, as many of you know, there is another very sizable group of people affected by growing inequality. They suffer from both expectations inequality and rights-based inequality. And the two experiences often coalesce in a single set of diminished life prospects. I mean, the two inequalities work together to produce an unacceptable amount of family instability, economic fragility, loss of opportunity, and a kind of unspeakable frustration. And it starts with the places where they live. Distracted by race and class, we often forget that place may be the biggest determinant of the opportunities that come a person's way in life. Where you grow up determines the quality of schools you'll attend, the tax base available for other public services like nice parks, quality libraries, and safe streets. These reflect the institutions of opportunity. And you know what they are. There's schools, their housing policy, responsive local government, infrastructure, recreation, healthcare, economic development, transportation. Basic stuff. If you own a home in a stable community, you have wealth that traditionally appreciated over time, opening up other opportunities like business startups, college tuition, weddings. Everybody knows this basic stuff, even realtors. Even realtors tell us it's 3 simple rules to the good life. Say it with me now. Location, location, location. Thank you. I can't see you, but I'm glad to hear you. What people almost always forget, however, is that every single group that struggles, and every single group that has struggled for more than a generation with all of the largest ills of inequality, probably lives in a segregated community, unprotected from rising costs and weaker institutions of opportunity. Every single one. They are disproportionately made up of African Americans, and for the last 2 generations or so, Latinos. Disproportionately, by wide margins. Quantifiable outcomes. We can readily measure this inequality. We don't have to argue. Now, things might be better if they could leave the resource-poor area, or if the area changed. But more often they can't, and it probably won't, unless it gentrifies, and then they must. So let me show you a couple of maps of northern New Jersey as an example of place to sort of make this point. The first shows the limited geographic distribution of black households. Excuse me. This is not all of New Jersey. This is research that we did in conjunction with my friends next door at Blaustein. So this is black residential penetration, and you need not see the detail here because it's sort of almost symbolic representation. Just focus on the brown. Where you see brown is the concentration of black population. So you see not very far, right? Quite a lot of concentration. Next is the distribution of Latino households. A bit farther, but not much farther. Now here is a map of where public housing was placed. Rather similar. And now, multifamily housing. If we looked at this map 25 years ago, it probably looked much more like the first 3, but it's changing as municipalities recognize, particularly with train lines, how they need more. But multifamily housing was always the thing that municipalities, at least in New Jersey, fought hardest against. Now I want to show you something else. I want you to compare that to this. This is a map of opportunity, where the places with the greatest fiscal health are in blue and green. Now, it's based on an opportunity index, which is an aggregate of several indices: family poverty, median income, job growth, unemployment, and there may be a 5th that I'm forgetting right now. But the point is, when you smush these things together, you realize that there are places of higher opportunity and lower opportunity, places where most of the institutions I rattled off a moment ago are experiencing fiscal health and strong resources versus other places that are truly overtaxed. And again, what's important here is to recognize how we flipped from those first 4 maps, right? The blue and the green are all in those areas opposite where the first 4 maps focused us. Now remember, and it correlates largely to race. Remember the American dream assumptions from my book. Well, in the areas of low opportunity, all the assumptions have worked in reverse. In fact, all of the assumptions I described have worked against the people who live in low opportunity areas, and for a variety of reasons. Behind each assumption is a set of rules and norms, institutional practices. I already noted about the first assumption, how government largesse that created so much wealth and human capital development in the post-war period excluded blacks. So this idea of self-sufficiency in the first assumption was simply not available as a public program of entitlements for blacks, not until much later. The assumption about segregation ignores continued residential patterns that affect even middle-class blacks and Latinos who, like their poorer cousins, tend to live in racially segregated communities. The assumption about racism no longer being a limitation ignores such obvious racialized policies like disparate school discipline protocols, mandatory minimum prison sentencing, the citing of environmental hazards in poor minority neighborhoods, and then of course the public spectacles like the government's reaction to Hurricane Katrina. So these folks contend with the effects of rights-based inequality because they've been forced into a kind of spatialized vulnerability by lots and lots of public policies and private practices that contain them in low opportunity places with weaker institutions and often very, very high costs, from everything from insurance to groceries. They are there in large part because of the legal operation of the American dream assumptions, which means that the very expectations born of the 1950s and experienced now as expectations in equality helped to give birth to rights-based inequality. But there's another missed irony in all of this. These people of color, these primarily black and Latino households living in low opportunity areas, are also working class. In fact, as the chart shows, they are disproportionately working class, which means they have struggled against the same structural economic forces that destabilized the white working class: the erosion of unions, the low wages associated with a service economy that offers none of the benefits of a bygone manufacturing economy, the high cost of higher education, the necessity of a college degree to get ahead, and the risk that shareholder profits and executive compensation will dictate employer decisions rather than reward workers. So as working class people, they share the same anxieties, face similar instability. They climb the same mountains of anxiety and worry about their children's fates in much the same way. And for me, this is the true missed opportunity. Nobody, really nobody but Trump taught us to worry more about the angry white working class. We were looking one way on inequality, and he made our heads turn. I mean, he swiveled us around so that we would see them too. Yet what could not be said for some reason, what was and remains missing from the narrative of inequality and accountability is that we are all here. Many of us are struggling, and we need each other, and we need each other's success. We need mutual recognition. And this was the chance to do it, and he wasn't interested in it. Here's a little more. Inequality can compound inequality. It can roll in on itself in predictable waves that sustain it and even make it worse. Inequality can be exponential, parasitic, cannibalistic. Remember how I described rights-based inequality as self-reproducing? It's not just that the rules that produce the patterns of inequality don't easily change. It's also that rights-based inequality reproduces itself with help from bad attitudes and discriminatory beliefs. So now I want to directly address racism. Take a deep breath. We're talking about both inequality and accountability. And racism has compounded inequality, denied us opportune alliances, and guaranteed its continuity. We will all bear the costs of inequality, but we will not bear them equally. And I want to give you two examples: psychological trauma and police brutality. Psychological trauma has finally made its way into public consciousness. We have become attuned and sympathetic to combat veterans returning from sacrifice in our wars with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We hear how they have difficulty maintaining relationships, working, sleeping, avoiding triggers, and how few of them trust the VA to provide adequate mental health care. We are ashamed every time one of them commits suicide, and they commit at least a suicide a day. These are young men and women whom we regard as innocent, sickened, and disabled by things they have witnessed or done or experienced for their country. While combat veterans do not alone deserve our sympathy, psychologists have known for 25 years at least that many Americans suffer from trauma-related disorders, especially the poor, particularly the extreme poor, and almost all of them since childhood. The sources of trauma include witnessing community violence, being abused or neglected at home, rape, domestic violence, violence at school. These are children whom we regard as innocent, sickened, and disabled by things they have witnessed or done or experienced because of where they live. Trauma exposure affects their brain development, sometimes permanently, often permanently. It causes depression, hypervigilance, an inability to concentrate, and quite naturally, the kind of behaviors that challenge their ability to learn, as well as their classmates' ability to learn, as well as their teachers' ability to teach. Rarely diagnosed correctly, many of these kids are punished for their disrupted behavior. Meanwhile, they fall further behind, or they get suspended. They get branded as a bad kid. They drop out. In some poor school districts, a majority of kids do not finish high school. A majority do not finish high school. In some school districts, an estimated 40 to 80% of kids suffer from partial to severe PTSD, only one of the many DSM-5 trauma-related disorders we know about, as well as a range of subclinical conditions that are equally disabling, at least from a learning standpoint. So imagine the multiples of trauma in those Chicago neighborhoods where last year one human being fired a weapon at another human being over 3,500 times. Imagine the multiples of trauma emanating through grief from the 766 homicides in that city last year. It stays with a person. It correlates to criminality, to mental illness, to incarceration, to drug and alcohol dependency, high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, and early death. As we are reminded by the opioid epidemic in white communities right now, desperate people who cannot avoid their thoughts and adapt survival mechanisms to feel safe or to dull pain do all kinds of things. So trauma, I argue, is the very costly symptomatology of inequality. This is what happens to people who live in impossibly difficult places over long, long periods of time. Racism put them there, and institutional racism keeps them there. It is more than a denial of opportunity. It is a denial of self. And it is the tragedy-reproducing symptom of a state of inequality that seems impervious to improvement. Now, the second example is police brutality. We fight a lot about this one. And I want to say up front that I know that the vast majority of cops in this country are good and hardworking public servants. I know cops personally. I have cops in my family. I respect cops. I work with cops. I need cops. A police force with integrity is a hallmark of a democratic society. It is a civilized jewel. But I also know there are bad cops, poorly trained cops, sadistic cops, cops who just should not be cops. Yet I am perpetually surprised by the white anger with which black outrage is met after an unarmed black person is beaten or killed by a police officer under suspicious circumstances. I am shocked to hear people proclaim that blue lives matter in response to assertions that black lives matter, or to hear the outrage against the death of another human being dismissed with flippant claims that all lives matter. The hostile responses to black protest are so contradictory, so infected with assertions of hierarchy that they clearly signal something more than the words themselves. I have also tried for many years, really all of my conscious life, to understand why so many white people choose to assume the identity of the police in these debates. They argue as if they were the police and the police were they. They deny blacks' actual experience of mistreatment in order to imagine the experience of a cop. These are strange existential juxtapositions that suggest something much deeper is going on. They don't really make sense otherwise. The protracted stalemate in our understandings, or more accurately, our misunderstandings, is truly amazing in a country that has seen such racial lopsidedness in who is hurt by police, a country with such a lurid, riot-filled history of harms, and so much official evidence of documented wrongdoing by entire police departments like Ferguson's and Chicago's and Baltimore's and Philadelphia's. So we can talk forever about this issue, and I imagine we will during the Q&A. But what I really want to point out about police brutality right now is its connection to both rights-based and expectations inequality through racism. This should never have been a fight over the existence of inequality or a battle of inequalities. This should never be a fair fight, because the Fourth Amendment prohibits the violation of a citizen's right to life and liberty without due process by a person clothed in state authority, like a police officer. This is just well established as far as basic constitutional rights go. So for the state, through its licensed agents, to take my life is surely the kind of wrong reserved for fascism and dictatorships. It is a penultimate wrong, in part because it is a breach of the public trust that holds all of us together. Our laws are clear about that. And if that's true, then the fact that for some reason you, another citizen, believes people like me have it coming because how you think people like me behave or dress or talk back or love or fail to love or work or fail to work, and we should be taught a lesson, is all really quite irrelevant. In a fight between my rights against your opinions, my rights should win every time, and vice versa. That's what rights-based equality promises each of us in a constitutional democracy. And yet it's not a fair fight. In fact, it has always been just the reverse. My rights to life and liberty as a black person have always been mediated through the opinions of white strangers, who in turn invest police officers with the authority to take my life with relative impunity. Think about that. Think about how that squares with the principle of freedom. No amount of evidence will sway them from questioning my conduct and siding with the police officer. Shot in the back, complying with demands, reaching for registration, being a child with a toy gun in an open carry state, begging for breath, holding a candy bar, flushing drugs, yes, flushing drugs down one's own toilet, being mentally disturbed and in need of professional help while my wife, my sister, my mother tries to inform you not to shoot me. And every new generation of law and order people opposing people who oppose police brutality ignores history, which is a real problem in our relatively young country. They ignore, if they ever knew, that using the police as an instrument of white supremacy has been an enforcement mechanism confronting black people since the paddy rollers of slave times and the black laws that empowered them. During Reconstruction, criminal laws targeted free slaves to recoup their labor, and local police were enrolled as bounty hunters. Imagining black personality as criminally inclined was the job of social scientists from the Industrial Revolution to the Progressive Era. On the ground and in the flesh, cops enforced this notion. Cops joined the KKK. Cops led mob lynchings. Cops left black people unprotected. Justice did not matter. The spectacle of injustice mattered. Keeping black people in their place and affirming that message to whites mattered. And if you knew that police in northern cities routinely beat up and killed blacks during the vaunted 1950s and 1960s, what reforms did you see that led you to believe the practices suddenly stopped during the 1970s and 1980s? The war on drugs? Are the countless Attorney General investigations we read about today of racial profiling, is that fake news? So there's a lot of evidence. For over 200 years, police brutality has been for both whites and blacks the very crucible of our fundamental relationship to each other as citizens. The most regular yet visceral contact that defines the unresolved conflict over our shared humanity on this part of the planet. And for all other Americans, each videotaped horror is a chance to bear witness to the signature American brawl, and a moment to decide, if they have a choice, which side of the power line they're on. And finally, the link between police misconduct and unequal rights, that is the connection to structure, really boils down to law. All of the history and all of these expectations of who is what and how much of our rights cops must respect boils down to our laws about police conduct in tense situations. And the legal standard is pretty straightforward. It's this: an officer is typically justified in using lethal force if he reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent a threat of serious and imminent physical harm to himself or to others. It is the reasonableness of this belief, of his belief, that implicates people's attitudes. If we see certain people as threats, we are more likely to find the officer's decision reasonable. Now, I want to translate this into practical terms for people who too often are on the short end of it. I want to suggest that for black and brown men in particular, what this legal standard really means in practical terms is surrender. Don't just do it, perform it. Convey the sense of humiliation implied by the term. It's not compliance the bad cop wants to see. He wants to see surrender. And that is the attitude of the bad cop's defenders. So the debate over police misconduct should not really be a fair fight. And yet every generation seems to get it turned upside down. A lot of things change in this country. A lot of things in our race relations change and progress dramatically. But not this one. This one hardly moves. Millions of Americans are certain that blacks have no reason to be upset by these killings, that they bring it on themselves, that they should just stop being uncooperative thugs. And unfortunately, these beliefs are often coupled with expectations in equality. These beliefs somehow make their way into the narrative about what needs correcting in a nation that has not provided enough opportunity for me, that has failed my expectations for getting my best self back again. And this, I suggest, is why police brutality is so important. Of course it's important for the selves whose lives are cut short or traumatized or materially damaged by an arrest and a conviction on their records, let alone doing time. And I'm talking about people who have not committed crimes. But it is important because of what it says about those other selves who will not even consider it a devastating aspect of our collective inequality problem in this country, because they cannot see their welfare. Because they continue to see their welfare on the side of officers who can never do wrong. We will not solve inequality through surrender. Each of us wants equality on dignified terms. Surrender was never part of the social bargain. Black people will never surrender in order to be full Americans. None of us wants our hopes forgotten or our needs ignored. We all want to feel like our country works with us to achieve our best self and will not leave us behind. So beyond the issue of police brutality, I'm worried about what transition means for this country and its long struggle with inequality, especially racial inequality. Donald Trump seems to see black people and really all people of color, so far as I can discern, through the jaundiced eyes of kind of smug suspicion. If he sees us, we are like problematic blobs, an undifferentiated league of Mexican rapists, Muslim terrorists. Remember when his appeal to blacks was, you're living in poverty, your schools are no good, you have no jobs, 58% of your youth is unemployed, what the hell do you have to lose? These words were not a recognition of inequality's hardships, the way he had so skillfully shown white crowds. These were not invitations. Instead, these were kind of calls to surrender. You've lost. Give up. Come quietly and you won't get hurt. No wonder his supporters have been known to say, there's a new sheriff in town. We get it. I think all people of goodwill understand the message. This is not a language that has ever worked to bridge our divides in the past. It is not meant to. Instead, it is meant to signal that ours is a nation of battling inequalities. And now that we're back in control, we will correct ours at the expense of yours. And so we all risk a kind of return to inequality as conquest. To say the promise will not keep seems obvious. To say it didn't have to be this way is naive, I know. To call it a missed opportunity is to indulge the sanguine swells of a middle school civics teacher. But I'll say it again anyway. You have to be careful about the words you use to discuss inequality. You can't just gloss over one side or another because the words tell about lives. People's experiences live in those words, and people don't surrender easily. Our struggle for equality will not be won through civil war. We will not become more equal by overcoming the other. We will overcome inequality by becoming a little more of one another. That's the bargain to which we should hold ourselves accountable. So here we are at goodbye. From meticulously rendered oratory to midnight tweets. From the sweet but false hope of post-racialism to the alt-right ascendance of racial backlash. From the honor of service to the service of threats. I fear the repudiation starts tomorrow. And I suspect that we will miss the decency of a good man, a very good man, who tried hard. We'll miss his commitment to examining evidence and his sincere efforts to speak to all of us at the same time. Our president was earnest, funny, and poised. We may even miss the smiles. We may sometimes find ourselves wishing to hear again those professorial statements of statesmanship when a capable mind offers his best explanation of complex realities and makes a good faith case for his decisions. In hindsight, we may come to recall those moments more as respect than as condescension. We will miss the various constructions of we rather than I, the automatic rhetorical turn to nosotros in his speeches. On race, we will surely miss the symbolic hope, so nuanced you may have missed it, that came from understanding that each of us is so complex that any people were many people, that black people were many people, the struggling and the strong, the shining and successful folks like him, the tragic yet trying, and everyone in between, sometimes wrapped in a single person. Obama reminded so many of us, so many of our children, that we are all powerful, really. All of us, every single one of all of us. We are each deserving of our potential to be our best, to get our best back. And we all live in a country that should be capable one day of affirming that. Like Let's Keep Trying, and I Love You, Yes We Can, are three of the most beautiful words ever uttered. And I think that we'll miss them. So we should keep saying them.